Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Sue Vita, the Chief of the Music Division here at the Library of Congress, and I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's presentation. And now I'm going to attempt to speak Brazilian, or to Portuguese, sorry. This is, the presentation tonight is the Luiz Hector Correia Azevedo. His collection, the Brazil-U.S. Musical Exchange and the Good Neighbor Policy. And this is the next installment in a lecture series that the Music Division happily co-sponsors with the American Musicological Society. We began this series about 15 years ago with the intention of highlighting research that was produced by researching the library's unique musical collections. And the American Musicological Society members have come over the years and used our collections, and this lecture series is the benefit of that. Over the past decade, we have been fortunate to learn about a variety of topics from Schoenberg to Showboat, and tonight we turn to Brazil and the United States music relations. As always, we are recording tonight's lecture, and it will be available to watch online in the coming months on the library's website and on YouTube. Past lectures are already available online. So for those of you who are here tonight, I'd like to point out that probably you already noticed, we have a wonderful collection of display materials relevant to tonight's lecture. And if you haven't had a chance to look yet, or even if you have, take a look at it on the way out, because the meaning of it will probably change after you've heard the lecture. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Allen Summerfield, Senior Music Specialist here at the Library of Congress and an AMS Council member, and he will introduce tonight's speaker. Paul.
Thank you, Sue. So tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Miranda Barrettira Tagliaras Sosa, who is a musicology PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh and will be defending later this spring. So congrats there for her. Her research focuses on Brazilian music from the turn of the 20th century, nationalism, modernism, and the relationships between music, race, and gender during that period. She is also interested in new forms of feminist agency displayed by Brazilian pop female and/or LGBTQ+ mainstream singers. She holds a Master of Music in Bass Performance from the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley and a Master of Music in Ethnomusicology from UNASP in Brazil. She has presented her work at several conferences, including the Latin American Studies Association, the Texas Music Educators Association, the University of Texas, the Society for American Music, and both regional and national meetings of the American Musicological Society. Miranda is also a double bassist, and she performs regularly with the University of Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. She recently conducted the Pittsburgh premiere of the Brazilian series, featuring the music of another Brazilian composer, Alberto Nepomuceno, in a performance derived from her own musicological research. So let's a round of applause to Miranda for her talk tonight.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, for joining me for this lecture. Before I start, I would like to thank this amazing staff of the Library of Congress, the librarians who actually made this lecture possible. And to the AMS too, I would like to thank AMS for making this event happen. Okay, so let's go to the lecture. In the summer of 2019, I planned my first visit to the music division at the Library of Congress, with the specific goal of doing research at the Alberto Nepomuceno collection. This is Alberto Nepomuceno. I was in the process of writing my master's thesis and having the possibility of doing some research on a 19th century Brazilian composer without leaving the US looked really interesting and practical, as I did not have funding for international travel then. I contacted the music division, and after a brief email exchange in which librarian Melissa Wertheimer helped me through the registration and scheduling process, I landed in Washington, D.C. for a week of research. Once I was at the reading room, Melissa told me about this collection she had been working on, and she thought it would be really useful to me. It was called the Azevedo Papers, or the Luiz Heitor Correa de Azevedo collection. She was just finishing the finding aid for that collection, which would be published sometime later on the Library of Congress website. Reading the finding aid for the first time was a shock for me. I was at the library to do research on a small but significant archive on one single Brazilian Romantic composer. And suddenly, I was presented with a huge collection in which most of the materials were written, recorded, created, or developed by one of the main names in Brazilian musicology in the 20th century. During that week, I saw the original drafts of foundational works written by Azevedo, like the book 150 Anos de Música no Brasil, which is in the display over there, 150 Years of Music in Brazil, and the draft for the first folklore course ever created in Brazil in 1939. After that first encounter, I knew that if I wanted to know more about Brazilian folklore, music history, composers, ensembles, performers, or international affairs related to music, and if I wanted a reliable and complex source in the US, in case traveling to Brazil was not possible, which actually happened during the pandemic, I should look through the Azevedo papers. Later, examining the collection, I was surprised to learn that between the years of 1942 and 1944, Azevedo had done field recordings of Brazilian folk music, and that these recordings were housed at the Library of Congress, a fact that is not exactly common knowledge among Brazilian music scholars. If you are an ethnomusicologist, you probably know that, but if you are a musicology, as I am, it's not like common knowledge. Between 1942 and 1944, Azevedo had traveled to Goiás, Ceará, and Minas Gerais, collecting more than 300 phonograms of popular and folk songs, poetry like romances, dance, and ritual music. These recordings were part of an international collaboration between music scholars in the US and Latin American countries, in which US institutions, mainly the Library of Congress, but some other governmental institutions were also involved, as we will see shortly. So they would lend recording devices and provide local researchers in Latin America with funding for fieldwork in exchange for the deposit of original recordings in their archives. Azevedo traveled and worked out of Brazil for a substantial part of his professional life, writing and teaching about Latin American music in Brazil, Europe, and the US. In this context, the collaboration between Azevedo and the Library of Congress seemed to be a particularly fruitful one. It enriched the archives of the Library of Congress, allowing American scholars to deepen their knowledge about regional popular culture in Brazil without the costs of an international flight. But it also resulted in the creation of a Center for Folk Research at the Universidade do Brasil, University of Brazil, which is now UFRJ, Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. The Centro de Pesquisas Folclóricas was the first formal institution in Brazil to focus on the study of popular or folk music. In 2001, with the creation of UFRJ's Laboratório de Etnomusicologia, the Ethnomusicology Lab, the Centro became an important repository of field recordings and vinyl collections dedicated to Brazilian folk music. Speaking of collaborations, the current director of the Laboratório de Etnomusicologia, Dr. Samuel Araújo, was one of the leading sources for this lecture I am presenting to you today. So I talked to him, and he told me about this collection at the Laboratório de Etnomusicologia. The collaboration between American and Latin American scholars then generated positive outcomes for sure. I think I'm a few slides late. The collaboration itself, along with the material, ideological, and political conditions that originated this intercontinental project and the resulting collections, are the subject of my talk tonight. Before I dive into the recording collection itself, however, I have to admit that after that first encounter with the collection in 2019, I was extremely intrigued by the Azevedo papers. I had so many questions. What was the role of the recordings collected by Azevedo in the establishment of a permanent sound archive in Latin American music at the Music Division during the 1940s? Why was Azevedo recruited for this job? And what were the reasons for attempting such an ambitious transcontinental project during World War II, when resources were probably scarce and travel was dangerous? Who are the people and institutions involved in this endeavor, and what were their goals? I looked for answers within the Azevedo papers, the collection here, which was very informative. The collection holds writings, receipts, correspondence between scholars and governmental agencies involved in the project, and in international diplomacy in the US and Brazil. Sound recordings, finding aids, or record cards in which Azevedo inscribed precious information, like the places and dates of collection of music, as well as the names of the musicians involved. I used a few external sources also, like an interview with Azevedo published in 1972 in the Revista Brasileira de Música, the Brazilian music magazine, a periodical he co-founded with other musicians and scholars in Rio de Janeiro during the 1930s, as well as academic works by Brazilian music scholars like Pedro Aragão and Samuel Araújo. Dr. Araújo also contributed with a brief about the record copies that stayed in Brazil and that finally are going to be digitized until July of this year. So, like some 80 years before the collection was deposited in Brazil. If the creation of the Azevedo Sound Recording Collection connected US and Latin American musicologists in the 1940s, the results of that endeavor continue to perform that same job as scholars in both countries access and re-examine the collection. Now that I established the subject of tonight's talk and that I said a little about the research process to prepare it, let me start from the beginning, or by introducing Azevedo. I am sure that many of the American musicologists, librarians, and ethnomusicologists I'm going to talk about tonight, like Carlton Sprague-Smith, Alan Lomax, and Charles Seeger, are well known to this audience. However, I believe you cannot say the same about Azevedo. Did you hear about Azevedo like before tonight? No, okay, so I'm going to introduce Luiz Heitor Corrêa de Azevedo to you. Luiz Heitor Corrêa de Azevedo was born in Rio de Janeiro in 1905 and started studying music by influence of his family. In 1924 and 1925, he attended the INM, the Instituto Nacional de Música, the National Music Institute, where he studied the piano. In 1928, also influenced by influence of an uncle who wrote for theatrical periodicals in Rio, Azevedo started writing music critique for the O Imparcial and A Ordem newspapers, a position that facilitated his contact with many Carioca musicians. Just a parenthesis, Carioca is a person that is from or is born in Rio de Janeiro. In 1930, following a movement that intended to renovate Brazilian music, headed by composer Luciano Gallet, Azevedo participated in the foundation of the ABM, Academia Brasileira de Música, or the Brazilian Academy of Music, becoming the first secretary and supporting composer Heitor Villa-Lobos as the president of that institution. Since then, the ABM has created a library, a series of scholarly seminars in music, and a publishing company with a significant role in preserving and showcasing Brazilian music. In 1932, Azevedo returned to the INM not as a student, but as the librarian of that institution. In 1934, the INM started the publication of the Revista Brasileira de Música, co-founded by Azevedo, and in which he wrote articles and published transcriptions of Brazilian music that was still unpublished. In this capacity, Azevedo highlighted the work of composers like Padre José Maurício Nunes Garcia, an important chapelmeister at the Rio de Janeiro court, and likely one of the first Black musicians to rise to a position of importance during colonial Brazil, a period in which Black people were perceived more as goods or objects than as true human beings, given the colonial model of plantation economy based on enslaved workforce, which unfortunately persisted in the country until 1889. In this context, we can say that Azevedo's musicological work started with the Revista, and as he not only recovered Brazilian composers whose work had been forgotten at the time, but also published excerpts of their music, generating scholarly interest in those works. He also worked as a reporter, interviewing musicians and composers, and possibly acquiring training for the field work he would do later. The Revista also allowed him to have contact with Mário de Andrade, a Brazilian poet, novelist, musicologist, and overall intellectual. I'm going to talk a lot about Mário de Andrade in this lecture. You can say like, well, I came here to watch a lecture about Luiz Heitor. Why are you talking about Mário de Andrade? I promise you that it's going to make sense in a few minutes. Andrade was part of the artistic cohort that presented the Modern Art Week, the Semana de Arte Moderna in 1922 in São Paulo, an event that intended to introduce modernist intellectual thinking to Brazil. One of the goals of this movement was to discover Brazilian folk, indigenous, and Afro-Brazilian musics, and to incorporate these pure Brazilian sounds to European or imported concert music in a search for a true Brazilian identity that was actually miscegenated, or also called Brazilianness or Brasilidade. Following that ideology of search for authenticity and purity in Brazilian culture, which is a little, an idea that is a little confusing because it's authentic and it's pure, but it's also miscegenated. Andrade traveled to Brazil during the 1920s, recording and documenting musics and dances, actually doing the same type of field work Azevedo and others would do in the 1940s for the Library of Congress collection. In 1934, he organized the Missão de Pesquisas Folclóricas, the Mission of Folk Research, a work of systematic recording and documentation of popular musics in Brazil. Andrade's findings were housed in the Discoteca Pública Municipal, the public municipal discotheque, a branch of the Municipal Department of Culture of São Paulo, which was directed by Andrade himself. His collection was organized by his student, Oneida Alvarenga, which is this pretty lady over there. And this collection became the largest archive of popular and folk music in Brazil during the 20th century, and a reference to scholars in Brazil and the Americas. This archive is still available for research and is now named after its organizer, Oneida Alvarenga. Azevedo admitted during interviews and in several articles or other writings that Mário de Andrade had a great influence in his interest in the study of folklore. In a letter from 1940, after accepting the task of traveling to record the pieces that would later become the Azevedo Sound Collection at the Library of Congress, Azevedo stated that it would not be possible to carry that project to term without the help and the expertise of Andrade. Quote, "Next year, Alan Lomax is going to Brazil to collect materials. I'm trying to help him in the organization of his plans, but I already told him that I believe it to be essential that the departure point for this tour be São Paulo, so they can learn from you and Oneida." Unquote. This quote highlights not only the fact that Andrade was possibly the most significant figure in the evolving field of ethnomusicological research in Brazil during the 1930s, even if the field was not named as such at that time, but that his actions influenced Azevedo and pushed him from a position of music librarian to researcher. Nothing against the librarians, it's just that I think Mário de Andrade pushed him into action to work on the creation of new archives of music that was still to be discovered by music scholars, and then studied, cataloged, and incorporated to highbrow repertories, which was like the ideology of the week of 22 of the modernists. The political climate of the 1930s Brazil may also have influenced Azevedo's decision. At that time, Presidente Getúlio Vargas, after rising to power through a coup d'etat, installed a type of governance firmly based on populism and nationalism. So there was a big push for finding a national identity. In this context, discovering the true Brazilian music of small remote towns and villages was not only a question of finding Brazil's true cultural identity, but it was also a way of fostering nationalist pride and consequently gaining support for an authoritarian dictatorship. In 1939, Azevedo became the chair of folklore studies at the INM, creating the first official course intended to discuss indigenous and African influences in Brazilian concert or highbrow music. An important feature in a nation that denied the impact of genocide of its indigenous populations since the beginnings of the colonization process, and that discarded the consequences of 300 years of enslavement of Black, African, and Afro-Brazilian subjects. And it was an important feature, even if the social theories in which the course was based on categorized the music of these peoples as primitive or less important than music from the European canon. In this context, the simple act of acknowledging the importance of peoples that were perceived merely as workforce or objects only 50 years before denoted a strong ideological change in Brazilian intelligentsia, which, for most part of the 19th century, emulated European models. In that same year, 1939, World War II started in Europe, changing economic and political relations globally. Also in 1939, the Division of Cultural Relations of the U.S. State Department promoted the first conference of inter-American relations in the field of music in Washington, D.C. Significant names in American culture like Harold Spivak, which was the director of the music division at the Library of Congress, Carlton Sprague-Smith, director of music division of the New York Public Library, William Berriem, from the American Council of Learned Societies, as well as representatives from libraries, recording companies, publishers, and move studios attended this conference. The main goal of the event was to foster collaboration, exchange, and integration between the countries in the Americas. This conference was idealized to attend to the principles of the Good Neighbor policy, applying them to the realm of culture. Implemented for the first time in 1933 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, though former President Woodrow Wilson had previously used that same term, the Good Neighbor policy was a set of directives for foreign affairs, which aimed for the improvement in the relations between the United States and nations of Central and South America, emphasizing trade and cooperation instead of military force to maintain peace and unity in the continent. Quote, "In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others." Unquote. During World War II, the Good Neighbor policy translated into actions that propagated the concept of Pan-Americanism, or the idea that countries in the Americas were tied by geography and common interests, like improving internal trade, overcoming the worldwide economic crisis of 1929, and creating a Pan-American bloc that was strong enough to fight against Nazi expansionism. While some scholars like Mário de Andrade and musicologist Francisco Kurt Lange criticized the Good Neighbor policy, stating that it was actually an endeavor with political and commercial goals, in which the United States intended to guarantee its own hegemonic political position in the continent, a politics of solidarity and peace among American nations actively tried to prevent authoritarian governments in South America, and particularly in Brazil, where the Estado Novo dictatorship of President Getúlio Vargas flirted with fascist politics in the 1930s, to align with Nazi Germany. Much has already been said. And in this picture, you have Getúlio Vargas on your left, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, like portraying it's a portrait of the good neighbor policy. I think it's very, explains a lot about this relationships of cooperation. Much has already been said about the uses of popular music and cinema to convey American propaganda in Latin America during World War II. But the music scholars involved in the projects of intercontinental collaboration at that time knew how to take advantage of the emergency war funding dedicated to the creation of cultural institutions that followed the implementation of the Good Neighbor policy, using them to actually expand the scope of folk music studies in the US and other countries in the Americas. The Pan American Union, an organization created during the first International Conference of American States, held in Washington, D.C. in 1890, was key in the process of promoting trade and good diplomatic relations between the nations of America. At first, the PAU acted as a mediator in commercial deals and agreements exclusively. Later, in the 1930s, several divisions were created to facilitate alliances in specific areas. In 1940, the music division of the PAU, having musicologist Charles Seeger as president, and with the support from the Division of Cultural Relations of the U.S. Department of State, established that one of its members, Carlton Sprague Smith, would tour countries from South America to recruit students, musicologists, and other local intellectuals who would eventually become collaborators, turning the plans of cultural exchange of that institution into action. The goals of Smith's Latin American tour were several. First, to verify the main collections, music archives, and conservatories in Latin America. Second, to observe the demand for local research and the presence of institutions that could support that research. Then to examine methods and music education programs, to make contacts with music institutions and with key persons for a posterior exchange, to verify the availability and conditions of concert venues, to classify folk Latin American musics, and, more important, to examine the possibility to offer scholarships and financial support to American students or musicologists interested in traveling to Latin America, or the other way around. The first music scholar to be contacted by the PAU in Brazil was Mário de Andrade. I told you it was going to make sense, okay? This contact was extremely fruitful, as the Public Municipal Discotheque agreed to send discs with copies of the recordings collected during the Missão de Pesquisas Folclóricas to the Library of Congress, in exchange for recordings of Haitian music, in a collaboration that lasted until 1945. Andrade, however, declined the invitation to travel to the US to visit the library and observe the methods of cataloging, classification, and analysis of folk music used in that institution. The poem A Nova Canção de Dixie, Dixie's New Song, explains the reasons for Andrade's refusal, which revolved around the flagrant racism and segregation in American society. Quote, "No, I'll never, never be in colorline land," unquote. And this poem does a clear allusion to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Andrade's refusal, nevertheless, seemed to be only geographic. He refuses to visit the US, perhaps also due to the fact that he was himself a mixed-race man, but collaborated with the Library of Congress in the exchange of sound recordings. At this point, Azevedo, occupying the position of librarian at the INM, was also in Smith's list of persons of interest. Smith offered him a position of consultant at the music division of the PAU, where he would contribute with the creation of a bibliographic catalog of Latin American musicians. Different from Andrade, Azevedo accepted the invitation and traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1941. It is important to highlight that the contrast between Andrade's refusal and Azevedo's prompt acceptance of Smith's proposal did not indicate a lack of racial consciousness from Azevedo's part. Instead, in a letter to Andrade, Azevedo categorized the visit to the US as an extremely seductive task, in which the potential to learn new skills that he would apply later on his musicological work outweighed the downsides that Andrade criticized in American society. During his visit to the US in 1941 and 42, Azevedo did work on the catalog, but also did a lot of field work with Alan Lomax, learning from his methods and approaches to the collection of folk music. Lomax, the director of the Archive of American Folk Song at the Library of Congress, impressed Azevedo with his expertise in collecting folk and popular music in the US and also abroad. In a letter from September 1941, Azevedo tells Andrade about Lomax and his recording laboratory. Quote, "I have seen extraordinary things in the fields that interest us. The Library of Congress has an archive of American folk song directed by Alan Lomax, which is equipped, I think, like no other organization of this sort in any part of the world. His recording laboratory is like a real record industry. It has an engineer to direct it and a large number of machines for the register of sound. I traveled with a little truck built especially for a phonographic collection of folklore. Inside of it, one can find all the materials for this task. The execution of the music is always preceded by a questionnaire arranged by Alan Lomax with ability. The Archive of American Folk Song is growing at furious speed because the recordings keep coming daily at the pace I have seen," unquote. So the archive was like fast and furious in 1941. Azevedo's quote denotes not only admiration for the methods and resources available to Lomax, but also highlights the imbalances between ethnomusicological research in diverse places of the Americas. For example, Azevedo himself worked with the equipment that was borrowed from the Library of Congress, and the process of this material that was collected from 1942 to 1944 is only effectively happening now in 2024, like 80 years after in Brazil. So it's a big discrepancy. The same material arrived at the Library of Congress around 1945 and 1946, and it has been archived, cataloged, and made available to researchers in digitized form since the mid-2000s. Nevertheless, after working on a daily basis with Lomax, Azevedo learned how to operate the recording machines and prepared to accompany Lomax during an exploratory trip to Brazil, in which the director of the AAFS intended to produce recordings of Brazilian folk music. However, in 1941, the US suffered with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, precipitating the involvement of the country in World War II. In those conditions, Lomax could not travel abroad as planned. The solution was to ask Azevedo to complete this task, which he accepted happily. However, not before asking Mário de Andrade for help in that enterprise. Quote, "You probably know already that I came from Washington with the task of collecting our folk music in discs to be sent later to the archives of American Folk Song of the Library, keeping a copy of them for the National School of Music. This is what became of the trip projected by Alan Lomax, which I wrote to you about and to which you replied. With the war, Lomax cannot leave the country, and Spivak asked me if I wanted to be in charge of this task. I clearly received it with great pleasure, but I promptly replied that this would be something I would need to do in collaboration with you. I have then to organize everything with you," unquote. Notwithstanding this letter, in which we can clearly see that Azevedo perceived Andrade as a mentor in matters of Brazilian folklore and archival creation and organizing, Azevedo did not work with Andrade in the collections for the Library of Congress. However, the choice of the states of Ceará, Goiás, and Minas Gerais was not a random one. During his missão de pesquisas folclóricas, Andrade had visited many parts of Brazil, but not the entire country. Azevedo believed that by collecting music from different regions of Brazil, it would be possible to create a cultural or musical map that would work as a portrait of every single region of the country. Then, thinking about completing this map of Brazilian folk sound, Azevedo picked the regions which Andrade had not visited previously. In this context, the work of the two researchers will serve as a complement to the other. So he would go to the places where Andrade didn't go before. Ceará represented the northern region of Brazil with a predominance of chants, desafios, which is a type of improvised competition in which a singer and viola player tries to defeat their opponent, and romances, a type of a story that is sung and sometimes even acted like as a play, derived from the medieval Portuguese genre. Goiás represented inner Brazil, with strong presence of modas de viola, which is a genre of song generally sung in intervals of thirds with viola accompaniment. And Minas Gerais represented the southeast region with the predominance of dances and Afro-Brazilian dramatic and religious ritual music. With a recording machine borrowed from the Library of Congress, 200 virgin discs, sapphire needles, and a budget of $1,450 to cover transportation and payment for musicians and informants, Azevedo returned to Brazil in 1942, where he recorded 311 phonograms in Goiás, Ceará, and Minas Gerais. A fourth trip to the state of Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil in 1945 completed the sound mapping of Brazilian folk music he had idealized years before. This last trip, however, did not have the support of the Library of Congress, as the resources for the Pan American project had finished by then. Like they didn't have any money left. Azevedo relied on funding from the state government of Rio Grande do Sul for that trip. The recordings he collected in that state are not part of the collection housed at the Library of Congress, but they are worth citing, as the destiny of this collection may give the audience some perspectives of the state of ethnomusicological research in Brazil by mid-20th century. The copies left in Rio Grande do Sul were lost. The only remaining copies of these recordings are housed at the Centro de Pesquisas Folclóricas in Rio de Janeiro. So, thanks to Luiz Heitor, these copies could survive. Dr. Samuel Araújo, the first professor admitted to a Brazilian university under the title of Professor of Ethnomusicology in 1995, has finally obtained the funds to process this collection, in addition to the other three collections. Until now, I have been talking about the context in which the Azevedo Sound Archives at the Library of Congress have been idealized and produced. This information is relevant, though. The entire project of collecting musics from the Americas would have never come to happen without the idea of Pan-Americanism, which would never have come to happen without the implementation of the Good Neighbor Policy, which directed funds and equipment that benefited cultural and musical exchange. Now I would like to discuss the recordings themselves, presenting the audience with examples of the materials Azevedo decided to collect. An archive always presupposes a process of choice and exclusion, in which one or more curators decides what is worth keeping and what is not, or what is displaying, for example, and what is not. According to Azevedo himself, in the first book of his folklore course, folklore was not constituted of traditional musics. Instead, it was the study of the material and intellectual culture of popular classes in civilized countries. Azevedo also believed that ethnography referred only to the study of primitive populations, or those populations that did not utilize any type of written tradition. So he made a differentiation between ethnography and the study of folklore. In this sense, cities were sites where the researcher could find folklore, which was not an exclusivity of remote locales of untouched culture. Regardless of the fact of using methods that involved fieldwork, interviews with musicians, the contextualization of music as part of a social phenomenon or environment, which are the basic elements in an ethnomusicologist's toolkit, Azevedo probably did not consider himself an ethnographer or an ethnomusicologist, but a folklorist, or a comparative musicologist at best. Given that the Society of Ethnomusicology was founded only in 1950 and that the first programs in the discipline were only established in the 1960s in the US, boundaries between disciplines were very porous by the time Azevedo did his field work on Brazilian folk music, which justifies his own particular approach to his field of music studies. I wonder what the Azevedo sound collections at the Library of Congress would look like if the same project was to be executed today. It would probably sound and look very different, and perhaps the researchers' priorities would also reflect contemporary anxieties regarding copyright, observant participation, consent, and some other issues. However, I will try to present the audience with Azevedo's perspective on his own work, which now, in the light of historical distancing, is open to discussion and recontextualization. Let's start by looking at his first exploratory trip to Goiás, Central Brazil. The first step in the building of the Azevedo Sound Archive at the Library of Congress started with planning. Azevedo produced an itemized to-do list with instructions for the entire process of traveling, approaching informants, he called them informadores, taking field notes, paying for transportation or eventual expenses, and finally proceeding to the recording of folk music. After planning a trip that would include stops in Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais, and the northeast of Brazil, Azevedo faced issues of practical order. Brazilian customs retained the discs and the recording machine. And when Azevedo finally had access to them, the machine missed a microphone. The original plans were revised and readapted to a new reduced schedule that would accommodate Azevedo's functions as a teacher at the University of Brazil and a folk researcher. The first stop of the inaugural exploratory trip was in Goiânia, capital of the state of Goiás, where Azevedo stayed only from June 24 to 27 in 1942. Accompanied by a student, Eurico Nogueira França, acting as a recording technician and engineer, he recorded sambas, waltzes, but mainly modas de viola, a genre of song accompanied by a viola, which is like a little tiny guitar, a smaller guitar with a varying number of strings and tuning systems. There are as many tuning systems for the viola as there are violas. It's a very complex instrument. Let's focus on a few of the recordings as Azevedo collection in Goiânia. And I actually chose some that I thought were significant, like to present some of the genres that he found like the most in these places, and also some that are like really oddballs or very different. The first one, the samba Canela Seca, was performed by José Turuna in the accordion and composed by the performer in 1932, according to the information he provided. So here we can see, again, that idea that folklore was not like traditional music, but music that was appropriated by the population, because this music had a composer, and the composer was performing the music. The second one, in contrast, is Calzinho, a moda de viola, sung and played on guitar and viola by Braulio Moreira de Mello and Sebastião Galdino, and composed by Galdino in 1939. According to Azevedo's belief that the central region of Brazil would have a predominance of melodical music genres with influences from Portuguese music, or the modas de viola, the majority of the recordings in the Goiânia discs is actually constituted of modas de viola. However, Azevedo also recorded the song Quebra Bunda, performed by Silvestre da Costa Pinto, and excerpts of a congo, performed by Pinto and other players. Azevedo only categorizes the quebra-bunda as a traditional dance by anonymous author and composer. The word bunda derives from the Quimbundo idiom from Angola, and it means your rear end. Yeah, it's a now resounding word, bunda. Likewise, the Congo is a syncretic dance that mixes African elements with Catholic religious elements. The samba is also derived from African musics, adapted and reformulated as urban music by the end of the 19th century. Firstly, it looks like the sample of folk music collected by Azevedo in Goiânia is relatively small. He only stayed in that city for 3 days, which would complicate his affirmation that the recordings were representative of an entire region of Brazil. And you know that Brazil is a very large country. Secondly, it is correct that the majority of the music he recorded in Goiânia were modas de viola. However, given the limited time he spent with local musicians and the restricted locality in which he collected folk music in that trip, it is possible that his statement that the modas were indeed representatives of that region was a generalization based on the small sample of musics he and Nogueira collected. Azevedo recorded a few inquiries or questionnaires about some of the pieces in the discs, but not all of them, which turned some of these recordings into some decontextualized sound objects. These recordings also present a low quality, like recording quality, and some are spoiled. In general, this first trip to Goiás seemed to be a period in which Azevedo and Nogueira were getting acquainted not only with the process of recording the phonograms themselves, but also with the procedures for categorizing and trying to inquire the sound object about the information it could convey to the listener. The second set of recordings was collected in the state of Ceará in 1934 in the cities of Fortaleza, Itapipoca, and Crato. Though the state of Ceará in the northeast of Brazil is fairly small, these 3 cities are geographically apart. Fortaleza, the capital of the state, lies on the coast of the Atlantic. Itapipoca is in the northwest, while the Crato is a region in central Ceará in the hinterlands. Brazil was still investing in infrastructure for transportation during the 1940s. And if at a first glance the 3 locations did not seem too far apart, some facts imposed a low pace to this project. Half of the discs Azevedo brought to Ceará was made of glass, and the entourage had to travel slowly to avoid damaging the recordings he had collected. The choice of recording in 3 different cities demonstrates that Azevedo had probably reflected not only on sample size when organizing his second trip of musical collection, but also in how representative of the music of Ceará or the northeast region of Brazil that sample would be. Another fact Azevedo and Nogueira took into account was the process of communication with local authorities that would facilitate contact with musicians from that region. Much of the trip to Ceará was arranged beforehand, and musicians gathered in enclosed spaces like movie theaters or churches where they performed their music for recording. While this type of arrangement probably facilitated Azevedo's work a lot, the authenticity of these sound objects is questionable. If these performances were staged, how representative of the current state of folk music in that region were they? Because they would gather in a movie theater and perform everything for these recordings. Regarding music genres, the recordings from Ceará were much more varied than the ones from Goiás. Azevedo collected desafios, romances, but also xangôs, cocos, congos, sambas, baião, cantoria, as well as commercial genres such as polkas, mazurkas, and songs. Many of these sound objects dialogued with everyday life, as they offered commentary on current political and social situations. Examples of these types were the tracks, one of the tracks that is called Os Impostos, the Taxes, sung by Vicente Martins de Souza, and Eu Tenho Achado Bom os Feitos do Presidente da Nação. I've been thinking that the President of the Nation has been doing good. A Louvação, sung by Virgílio Batista de Lima and Antônio Augusto Ribeiro, accompanied by 2 violas. In the realm of dance or ritual music, the influence of African elements is easily perceived in tracks like Songs of the Maracatu As de Ouro, which was recorded in Fortaleza, or the Xangô by Raimundo Alves Feitosa, accompanied by an ensemble of Afro-Brazilian instruments formed of drum, cuíca, gongue, and ganzá. During this trip, Azevedo did not record any inquiries or interviews with the musicians, keeping these informations in his notebooks only. These notebooks with the field notes, however, are part of the Centro de Pesquisas Folclóricas in Rio collection. So the Library of Congress does not have these field notes. The Library of Congress does not hold any copies of these notes, and so some of these sound objects from this collection may look a little decontextualized when you cannot read about them, like the notes about the collection. Anyway, the trip to Ceará appeared to be much more successful than the one to Goiás. Azevedo recorded more music in varied genres and in diverse localities, which was a big contribution to the documentation of different genres of folk music of Northeast Brazil. The last trip sponsored by the Library of Congress happened in 1944, when Azevedo, accompanied by another student, Euclides Silva Novo, traveled to Minas Gerais, as Nogueira was temporarily unavailable due to his work at the INM. He was working at the INM at the time. This time, Azevedo took 2 months in the field, January and February 1944, and the research logs state that the recordings were obtained in the state of Minas Gerais in the cities of Diamantina and Belo Horizonte, but mainly in Diamantina, which is Belo Horizonte is the capital of the state, and Diamantina is a smaller city. Many genres of popular commercial music appeared among these recordings: waltzes, modinhas, and songs. Azevedo insisted on the concept of folklore as popular knowledge, as demonstrated by one of his letters from the field. And this letter is housed at the Laboratório de Etnomusicologia in Rio de Janeiro. Quote, "The purists and quintessentials of folkloric science will be very scandalized by a bunch of documents I recorded, and that can be classified as more as bourgeois than properly popular. Waltzes and serenade modinhas, band dobrados, religious parade marches, etc. But it's whether I don't know folklore, or folklore is the science of tradition, a tradition known by all. Of all this music, the performer doesn't know the authors, and everybody in Diamantina knows and sings these pieces. They have the same function of English ballads that evidently were composed by someone, but that were appropriated by the people, converting them, therefore, in folklore," unquote. It is striking to notice that besides the obvious relationship between certain types of musics and ethnic groups, which he actually did, Azevedo also connected folk music with the concept of class, stating that some of his recordings resemble bourgeois music. This is an example of the ways in which an archive, and the conclusions one can arrive at after an exercising of interpretation of the archive, can help perpetuate racial and social stereotypes, depending on the reading you do of the archive. The presence of recordings of pastorinhas performed by the pastorinhas from the Repositório dos Pobres and Folia de Reis, performed by a group from the Nossa Senhora da Luz Church, indicates that some of these recordings, following the same procedures adopted in Ceará, were staged for recording. Pastorinhas and Folia de Reis are groups that gather to make music and celebrate Christmas, or the period between Christmas and January 6th, which is the Three Kings Day, which are possibly not performing anymore by the time Azevedo arrived in Minas Gerais. He didn't arrive at the beginning of January, but at the end of the month. On the other hand, there are other tracks called visungos, or songs to carry the dead in a hammock, and a pregão para vender pirulito, an announcement to sell lollipops. The first ones, the visungos, could be categorized as a very specific type of work song, while the latter is not exactly a song or musical piece, but a sound object in which spoken language and music intermingle. In this sense, including these pieces in a collection, and especially the pregão, indicates that by the time of his third exploratory trip, the practice of fieldwork had probably expanded Azevedo's understanding of what Brazilian folk music was, and which sounds should be recorded, analyzed, and preserved in an archive. As it frequently happens in any type of music research, and even more in ethnomusicological projects that deal with living and changeable objects and subjects, which is not always the case in musicological studies. For example, in musicology, you can just analyze some type of music, which will not change like over time. The process of research itself can change the questions and conclusions a researcher draws from their object of research. This seems to be the case in Azevedo's change of attitude regarding sound objects by the end of his collaboration with the Library of Congress and the AAFS. After the end of that recording period, the AAFS and Azevedo envisioned future partnerships that did not come to term due to the exhaustion of funding for the Pan American Music Collection project. While many of the notebooks with field notes stayed in Brazil, all the discs with original recordings were deposited at the Library of Congress in a bureaucratic process that involved embassies and consulates in Brazil and in the United States. So these are two of the many documents describing how these recordings left Brazil and came to the United States, which they didn't call FedEx or anything. They had to do this through like the official channels, embassies and consulates. After many delays caused by the war, the recording equipment, which was a Presto recorder, remaining discs, and needles, were returned to the Library of Congress in 1945. The official documentation for the project is housed both at the American Folk Life Center and at the Music Division of the Library of Congress, and is available for research. This material, of particular interest for those focused on international relations, is exemplary of the huge amount of diplomatic work behind the musical project idealized by Lomax, Seeger, Spivak, Sprague-Smith, Azevedo, and many others. So it was not only a matter of music, but it was also a matter of diplomacy and a lot of like behind-the-scenes work. In 1947, Azevedo moved to Paris, where he became the music program specialist for UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. In this capacity, Azevedo promoted Brazilian music in Europe and created exchange programs, facilitating performances by Brazilian musicians in France. Between 1953 and 1968, he taught courses on Latin American studies at the University of Paris. Drafts of these courses are among the holdings of the Azevedo papers at the Music Division, and some of them are over there in that table. The division also carries copies of the first course on folklore that Azevedo created in Brazil, when he was still developing his own skills in ethnographic and ethnomusicological research, and also many pedagogical materials he used at the University of Paris. Aside from vacation trips, Azevedo did not return to Brazil after 1947, dying in Paris in 1992. His Center for Folk Research, however, survived Azevedo's absence and housed diverse pedagogical projects that ultimately justified the institutionalization of ethnomusicology as an academic discipline in Brazil. In the US, the project of Pan American Folk Music Collection, as well as the methods developed by Lomax, Seeger, and others involved in that endeavor, helped shape ethnomusicology as a field in itself, with approaches and research procedures that are diverse from those of historical musicology or musical analysis or even theory. In this sense, the Library of Congress and the projects supported by the AAFS were at the core of the constitution of diverse fields of music studies in the United States and also in other parts of the Americas. So I would like to finish my talk today with a reflection on the outcomes of the project that made possible the existence of the Azevedo collections at the Music Division and at the American Folk Life Center. Azevedo's fieldwork was not completely without fault. Some performances were staged for recording, framing folk music in a complex space between authenticity or fabrication of cultural manifestations. Azevedo's associations between music, class, and race, as well as the inclusion of racial pseudoscience in the foundations of his folklore course at the INM, certainly contributed to sustain stereotypes about Brazilian peoples, ethnic groups, and regions. Also, the proposition that culture is fixed and static, and that a set of sound recordings would provide the listener with a picture-perfect portrait of Brazilian musical culture by region seems a little naive. Culture, as well as people, changes constantly, acquiring new meanings. In this sense, the Azevedo collections are one representation of Brazilian folk music at a given time, in a given space, created under particular ideologies from that time, from the time in which they were produced. On the other hand, the positive outcomes of Azevedo's work are undeniable. He created an important center for the documentation of folk music in Rio de Janeiro, and most of all, contributed to the institutionalization of anthropological and ethnomusicological studies in Brazil, which is, I think, that is very important, very significant contribution. The striking contrasting conditions of conservation and maintenance of the same sound archives in Brazil and in the US indicates that, even with good intentions, the principles of collaboration between North and South American music scholars did not solve all the issues and imbalances of economic power and social interests the program intended to overcome. More than the economic disadvantages, countries in Latin America still suffer from lack of political will when it comes to the creation of mechanisms of protection and preservation of their culture, be it folk or not. On the other hand, the Azevedo Sound Archive at the Center for Folk Research at UFRJ has been the subject of at least 5 academic works in the last 10 years, 2 of them published in book format, and 2 others awarded by the IFAM, the Instituto do Patrimônio Histórico Artístico Nacional, for the quality of their analysis. This interest in the constant recontextualization and revision of the Azevedo sound collections demonstrates that archives can effect changes in the development of academic fields or disciplines. Archives are not simple depositories of old papers and memorabilia, like you don't want those old papers anymore, you just put them there. It's not exactly that. But actually, archives are living organisms that can be reappraised and reimagined, extrapolating their original meanings and fostering new interpretations. Thank you.
If you have a question.
Ask me a question. Ask me a question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This is very interesting. One question I did have is the descriptions of the music, of the recordings. Where is that available? Is it at the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro?
The descriptions are actually available there and here.
Okay, because you did say that some were not labeled and some did not have the same descriptions, or was that?
Yeah, some of the recordings, in some of the recordings, he actually recorded a questionnaire with the musician before the recording, and some others he did not. So these are a little kind of like up in the air. But you still have like the cards with, at least with the name of the musician, and if he could find some information like about like who composed that piece or something like that, he would just put it there. And some of them have no information actually. Like when I think like when he thought that the music was traditional, or when maybe the musicians themselves didn't know how to respond to that. Like, so then this information is not there. But there's the information about like, at least like who is performing, and if there are instruments, which type of instruments.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I was curious to know why he never went back to Brazil. It seems like a really long time to not go home for a visit at least. And I wonder if there was something going on politically or something like that that prevented his safe return.
I think it's simply because he became a consultant with UNESCO, and this job was based in Paris. And actually, Dr. Samuel Araújo was telling me that recently his daughter went to the UFRJ, to the university, and she was taking pictures of the building. And then they started talking, and she said, "Okay, I'm the daughter of Luiz Heitor." And she's actually French. She's not Brazilian. So I think that when he got that job, he simply moved to Europe, and then he got that other job at the University of Paris. So maybe he decided to stay there.
There's always time for more questions while we have the display over here. So let's give another round of applause to our speaker this morning.
Thank you so much.